Pray. Our all-wise and loving Father who art in heaven, we're so thankful for the privileges and the opportunity that we have this morning to come in thy presence and to open thy word and to study. We're thankful, Father, for this congregation and their willingness to host this upcoming discussion this week. Pray, Father, that your will be done. Pray that the truth is defended and proclaimed, that error is exposed, and the people are converted, that people will see the light and come to thy Son through your word. Pray, Father, your blessings upon the class teacher this morning. And as we open up the book of Ecclesiastes, we pray, Father, that the practical insight that you provide us will guide us, and we will develop a more genuine spiritual mindset as we look at the things that are in this world, and as we experience those things. We pray, Father, that we'll always learn and understand the need to look beyond those things and to the spiritual and the true reality that you provide for us through your Son, Jesus Christ. We're so thankful, Father, for those who proclaim thy truth, and for the teacher this morning. Pray that the things he has prepared will not only come to his mind readily, but he'll be able to express those things in a way that are easy to understand. Pray, Father, your continued blessings upon all of us as we strive to serve you each day, that all that we say and all we do bring glory and honor to your most holy name. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
All right, we just finished studying the Song of Songs on Wednesday. We spent about 10 lessons on that, but we spent a few lessons of introduction at the beginning of this class, and I'm going to spend 1 or 2 lessons on introduction to Ecclesiastes. I think it is important to introduce the books of Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes because there is probably some of the most doubt about these books and about the authorship of these books. We won't spend nearly as much time talking about the style of writing. When we studied Song of Songs, we spent a bit of time talking about love poetry and compared that to what was outside of the Bible, and how that when you come inside the Bible, you see some similarities, but you also see some major distinctions. And so we don't necessarily have to go into all that, but I would like us to take some time to think about what this book is, who wrote it, why it was written, and I think that'll be helpful to us. I'm also not going to spend a lot of time trying to defend the inspiration of this book, though it is one of the more contested books as you read through various commentaries. I'm simply going to make a case that Solomon did write it, that Solomon was inspired to write it, and that when we read it, it's going to be profitable to us. So I'm going to be working from that assumption, and I'm going to give you some reasons why I believe that. But let's start off with the title of Ecclesiastes, because it is a fairly strange sounding title. But when we see that word, we should see a Greek word that we are somewhat familiar with, and that is the word ecclesia. And ecclesia is the word for church, assembly. And so if you just add an additional ending here, what you come up with is one who gathers an assembly and one who speaks to an assembly. And this fits well with what we see in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 1. The words of the preacher, the Ecclesiastes, the one who gathers the assembly and speaks to the assembly, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And Ecclesiastes is really just English letters spelling out the Greek title of Ecclesiastes, which is translating the Hebrew title of the book of Ecclesiastes. In Hebrew, it's Kohelet, and it's the same meaning. So all of these are basically pointing us to this idea of the preacher, the one who speaks for the assembly. And it shouldn't surprise us that this has come to be the title. As you start reading this book, you have 2 words in Hebrew, the words of the preacher. And so we're going to that second word and saying, this is what this book is about. It's about this preacher, and it's about this preacher preaching. We're going to see the word Kohelet used throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, three times in chapter 1, in chapter 7, and chapter 12. And we find that he continually refers to himself as a preacher. So I'm going to suggest that as we read through this book, we need to be reading it as a sermon, if you will. That this is a message that is being proclaimed to an assembly, and we have to figure out what kind of people would be hearing this. Now, obviously, just about all of the Old Testament was written directly to Israelites, to Jews. And if there were some who would benefit who are outside of the Israeli and Jewish camp, then that would have been somewhat secondary. That most of the time, even the books that are written to the king of Babylon are really written for the people of Israel. And so we should read it in the context of this is a book for the assembly of God's people in the Old Testament, and that he refers to himself as a preacher or the speaker of the assembly probably indicates that he is intending to impart wisdom to these people because we are situated in the wisdom literature. And so we, of course, have various poetic books, but when we come to Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and come back to Job, these are our wisdom books in the Old Testament. And I put in parentheses there that this is unconventional wisdom. And I don't mean that it is false, erroneous, or anything along those lines. But what I mean is it's not the same kind of wisdom that we read about in Proverbs. Though there is overlap, that in Proverbs, as we've talked about in various studies, you have the general truths. And so it's basically, if you do this, most of the time, this is what is going to happen. And so it's more on the positive side. I would suggest that Ecclesiastes is not contradictory to that wisdom, but it's almost like it's taking a step before that wisdom, or maybe giving us the other side of the coin to that wisdom. Because what Ecclesiastes says, as Job also says, is sometimes life doesn't work out the way you think it will. Sometimes life is chaotic. Sometimes it is confusing. Sometimes it is depressing. Sometimes it is frustrating. And he says, you know what? There's wisdom even in this. And the reason I say it might be taking a step back is because Proverbs starts from the assumption that you fear God, or if you fear God, it will lead to wisdom, and wisdom will lead to a more beneficial or profitable life. Ecclesiastes is saying, what if you are questioning the sovereignty and your reverence for God? How do you get to that wisdom? How do you get to the fear of God so that you can get to the wisdom, so that you can get to the benefit that wisdom can provide for you? So that's how I'm going to be kind of looking at Ecclesiastes. Is here is a preacher who has experienced life, who has experienced the futility, the vanity, the shortness of life, and now he is writing about that. And so that's why this is called Ecclesiastes, because we have some words to hear from a preacher who had lived life and had wisdom for those who would listen. All right, so the big question then is, who is this preacher? And the book does not directly say, I, Solomon. It says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. But then when you get to, for instance, verse number 12, you have I, the preacher. So we kind of have the framing at the beginning of this is the kind of a narration, the words of the preacher. But then you actually have the person who's writing this book calling himself the preacher. And so this is the words of the preacher. And even if he does not directly say, I am Solomon, I would suggest that when you read through the book, it's hard to not see it as this person looking like Solomon, claiming to be Solomon. Now, those who doubt that, and we're going to talk more about those who doubt it in just a moment, they would say, well, this is a person well into the time of the Persians or the Greeks, and he's just putting on the persona of Solomon. I'm going to suggest that that is not what we have here. Really, and let me give you, kind of put my cards on the table beforehand, is that what we have is really just an approach of doubt when you are looking at it that way. You're looking for reasons to doubt. Not that there aren't some things that we need to work through, but this has been approached as a book that was written by Solomon. Traditionally, that's what it's been. It's been that there's a reason the Jews accepted it as part of their scriptures, and they recognized these are the words of Solomon. Now, let's just read through a couple of things and see, does this not sound like Solomon? For instance, Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. All right, David had multiple sons, but here is David's son who is king. I remember my brother being a little bit snarky. I don't know if it's probably okay that I tell this story, but if not, then I'll ask forgiveness later, I guess. But he says he was in his college days, and he had there was a teacher at the time who was saying, well, we can't really be sure that it was Solomon or not. And so when one of his friends came out of that class and said, I'm not sure, Kohelet, let's just call him Kohelet. That's the Hebrew word for the preacher. And Colton was like, oh, Kohelet. Kohelet, the son of who? Oh, the son of David. The king of what? Oh, the king of in Jerusalem. That's interesting. And so he started leading them through that idea of how does this person portray himself? He portrays himself as the son of David who is king in Jerusalem. Now, let's keep reading. Let's look at 12 and 13 of the same chapter, Ecclesiastes 1, 12 and 13. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. Let's pause there for just a second. Not only is he king in Jerusalem, but he's king over what? He's king over Israel. Now, unless this person is just lying, this situates us in the period of the United Kingdom, or at the most you could say is, well, maybe Northern Kingdom, but not in Jerusalem. So now we have to have someone who is in Jerusalem, who is ruling over all of Israel, who is the son of David. And verse 13, and I gave my heart to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous endeavor that God has given to the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. So now we have a preacher who is son of David, king in Jerusalem, king over all Israel in Jerusalem, who also sought after wisdom. I can't think of anybody else besides Solomon. So this person is definitely portraying himself as Solomon. Look at verse 16. He continues with that vein of seeking wisdom. I spoke within my heart, saying, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has seen an abundance of wisdom and knowledge. Now, we're going to come back to the idea here in verse 16 in just a moment, that more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, that has brought the ire of certain liberal scholars who would say, well, David was the only one in Jerusalem, over Jerusalem before him. We're going to come back to that idea, and I'm going to show that it's not as big a deal as certain commentators make it out to be. But again, someone who is magnified and sought after an abundance of wisdom and received it. Let's drop down to chapter 2 and verse 4. And here's where I don't think anyone could read this and not say this author is portraying himself as Solomon. I made my works great. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made for myself gardens and parks, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made for myself pools of water from which to water a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. Also, I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of sons and men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes asked for, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any gladness, for my heart was glad because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. We have a preacher who is son of David, who is king in Jerusalem, who is king over Israel in Jerusalem, who has sought after much wisdom, who has had many building projects, who has brought in many concubines, and who has tried to maintain his wisdom through all of that. Who is this? Now, someone could just say, well, this is just someone pretending to be Solomon. Here's the major issue with that. There is no other book in the Bible that those who were recognizing Scripture, either among the Jews or among Christians, and were bringing it together for us by the providence of God, who said, we will accept a book that is written under a false name. That was one of their key reasons for rejecting any book, is if it claimed to be Peter and was written in the 2nd century, they tossed that out. If it claimed to be something associated with Abraham but was written centuries after that, they tossed it out. Why? Because they recognized there is the necessity of truth and true portrayal of oneself in authorship, and so they rejected it. Now, some have, on various internal grounds suggested, well, maybe he presents himself as Solomon just for a specific literary purpose, and then later on he kind of leaves that behind. I'm going to suggest there's a consistency all the way through. He presents himself as Solomon because he is Solomon, and he's going to give wisdom that transcends merely his situation and his kingship, so that he can get to the end of the book and say, here's what I figured out in all my wisdom. You need to fear God and keep his commandments. There's a consistency to this book that shows we are talking about the same author and the similar purpose all the way through. And we'll get to that purpose in just a moment. Now, the three pieces of evidence that are used against Solomon being the author are: one, unique vocabulary; two, ambiguous identifying statements, that is, identifying himself in what some believe ambiguous ways; and certain canonical concerns. I'm not going to talk much about the first or the last one. If you are interested in getting into all the technical vocabulary stuff, there are some commentaries I can recommend to you that show that those arguments that it borrows Persian and Greek words from much later on, that there's not a lot to those arguments, and they have been soundly defeated, in my mind, through various arguments, but that's outside of the purpose of our class here. So I don't think that's a very good argument. And the canonical concerns, just because later Jews question the authority and inspiration of this book, does not mean that the people who first received it didn't know it was from Solomon and accept it immediately into the canon. So we're going to ignore that. But I do want to come back to an argument that I see often used, and we saw it 3 times in chapters 1 and 2, is, doesn't it seem strange if this is Solomon that he is saying, I was king over before. I had more wisdom than all who were over Jerusalem before me. And they say, well, wait a second. David was the only other king in Jerusalem before him. And so how could we have this statement, all who were before me? Doesn't it make more sense that he's just putting on the mask of Solomon, and we're well into the divided or even after the divided kingdom, and he's just looking back to all the kings? I want to suggest this is not a very good argument, because we are going to see that just because you have, though they suggest only one, David, is it not possible that we also have Absalom? Is it not possible that we also have all the Canaanite kings, the Jebusites, who would have been over that city before? And furthermore, look with me, in my daily reading several months ago, I was in 1 Chronicles, and I came across this phrase that I thought was interesting as connected to this argument. And that's 1 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 25. 1 Chronicles 29 and verse 25. All right, and so we have David making Solomon king. Solomon being made king the second time. And it says in verse 25, and Yahweh highly exalted Solomon in the sight of all Israel, and granted to him royal majesty, which had not been on any king before him in Israel. Does this not express that this is just a phrase to say he was greater than everyone before him? And so if we can see that phrase here and not say, well, that should make us doubt whether or not we're even talking about Solomon, why can't we apply that same logic when we come to Ecclesiastes and say, he is saying his wisdom was greater than anybody else over Jerusalem, whether that be his father David, whether that be his brother Absalom, whether it be the even though this wasn't in Jerusalem, you've got others who are vying for the throne around Solomon's early reign. You've got the kings of the Canaanites before that. He is saying there's been no one greater in Jerusalem. There's been no one greater over Israel. And so this seems to be kind of a stock phrase, and doesn't necessarily indicate that this wasn't Solomon. This is just a phrase to show he was greater than all the rest. And does that not picture what we have with Solomon? I think you're going to be talking about that a little bit with your typology lesson, unless you've completely shifted ideas on me. But Solomon is kind of in a sense, the apex of the power of the son of David. And so we should expect that when we come to Ecclesiastes. All right. Now, the final point I want to make here on authorship is that the tone and language of Ecclesiastes suggests that Ecclesiastes, sorry for the misspelling there, is a late life confession of Solomon, an admonition especially to his sons. So this is how I'm going to be teaching it, and I know there's debate on this. I think as we read through the book, what we see is that this is someone who has lived a long life. When you get to chapter 12, he seemed to be speaking from experience when he talks to the young man and says, this is what it's like when you get older. And so it seems that we have someone who is older. It is Solomon who is looking back at his life and saying, I did not find purpose, I did not find meaning in all these things I accumulated because I was missing something in the midst of all that. And so he has a word. He is acting as a preacher, an old preacher speaking to another generation. In fact, we even have some of the wisdom sections in Ecclesiastes that will talk about his son or his sons, and whether that be just physical sons or whether that be anyone who listens to him, his learners, his disciples. He has a word as an old preacher who's lived and gained wisdom, and he says, now there was a part of wisdom I was missing. You don't miss that part. And if you can gain that, then you're going to find your identity, your meaning, your purpose, and it's all going to be wrapped up in God. That's why I have titled, as if you use the handouts, I've titled this series on Ecclesiastes, The Search for Meaning. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment as it relates to our time. But let's go here to the purpose of Ecclesiastes as we fit in this idea of the search for meaning. So the purpose of Ecclesiastes, as I'm going to be presenting it, is to explain the meaning of human existence, that people should fear God and find satisfaction only in Him, even amid the chaos of the fallen world. And our kind of key passages to uphold this idea is Ecclesiastes 2, 24 and 25, Ecclesiastes 3, 11 through 14, and Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. Let's read those together. Ecclesiastes 2, 24 and 25. And I will ask for someone to read 2, 24 and 25. Who wants to do that? All right, Andrew? All right, that question at the end, what's the implication of who can eat and have enjoyment apart from him? What's the implication of that question? No one can. You cannot find satisfaction apart from God. Even the simplest things of life are going to be meaningless. They're going to be vanity. And in our first lesson, we're really going to focus in on that vanity idea, so I'm kind of skipping it for now. Let's go to chapter 3. Verses 11 through 14, 3, 11 through 14. Who wants to read that for us? All right, Lance.
He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in his lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. Know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him.
All right. As we read this, what is the major point? What are we supposed to see about God in 11 through 14? What is this teaching us about God?
All good things come from him.
All good things come from him, and?
It is put within the heart of man that eternity is in the future.
All right, he said eternity in our hearts. You have to read my mind, but I've got one more.
It's complete.
Complete? That wasn't it, so we got one more.
The man shall fear him.
The man should fear him. Good point, but that wasn't what I was looking for. The point I'm looking for is he's in control. Notice the sovereignty of God in this statement. You have a time for this, a time for that. God has made everything appropriate. And he has set it up for a specific purpose, that is to fear him. And so we have this picture of God is in control. So you can't find satisfaction apart from God, and God is in control of everything that is going on so that we can learn the contentment based on our fear of him. When we get a good picture of who we are and who God is, that's what's going to bring greater satisfaction, purpose, meaning into our life. Which comes to chapter 12. Chapter 12, I know this one is well known. Probably some can even quote it, but let's read verses 13 and 14. Who wants to read that for us? All right.
Kevin, did you raise your hand? Uh, 13 and 14, 12, 13 and 14.
Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil.
All right. So as you come to the conclusion of the book, he highlights, here's the application of this, here's what you need to do with this. And I think what he has done all the way through this book is to say, God is in heaven, you're on earth, and you need to act like you are on earth and God is in heaven. And when you do, you can find some satisfaction here on earth until that day of judgment when he judges you according to your works. And if you are the kind of person, as we're going to see in one of the chapters, who fear him, it's going to come out all right at the end. But you need to recognize that everything is not fair here on earth. But that does not mean God's not in control, that God does not have a purpose for all of this, and that when we situate our identity in him, then we're going to be able to work through those difficulties to get to the wisdom that he wants us to attain. All right, so I don't think it is, I know it is not contradicting Proverbs, but like I said, I think it is taking a step back and saying, this is why you should fear God, even in the midst of difficulty. Job is saying the same thing from a slightly different point of view, or at least a slightly different purpose. It is ultimately saying, will man serve God for nothing? And Job says, yes. And that proves something to Satan. Ecclesiastes, Solomon is saying here, life is going to be very difficult at times. What are you going to do with God? And what are you going to do toward God in the midst of all this? And are you going to find satisfaction or attempt to find satisfaction in the world? Or are you going to try to find something that transcends? There's another phrase that's going to be used in Ecclesiastes that we're going to be watching for. I said we're going to come back to vanity in our first study. But then also we're going to see that phrase, under the sun or under heaven. And I think that's an important phrase to look for as we study through Ecclesiastes, is that often we are going to be taking a under the sun perspective. How do you get a transcendent perspective, a spiritual perspective, a Godward perspective? Because if it is only under the sun, you're going to have some problems in this life that don't have any answers. But you got to be looking for something beyond. All right. Now, Solomon thus employs a somewhat unique approach in Ecclesiastes, that he emphasizes the futility of life apart from God, speaking not primarily as a skeptic, a philosopher, as an apologist, but again, as a preacher. So I want us to hear Solomon's voice as a preacher. I've read multiple books on Ecclesiastes, some that try to say, well, here is someone who's losing their faith. He's a skeptic. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think we're going to see plenty from beginning to end that this person does believe in God, is just trying to work out some of the details of God's work, and ultimately coming to, I don't necessarily have to figure out all those details. I don't think he's working as a philosopher necessarily, and I don't even think it's necessarily just as an apologist, that is a defender of the faith. I think he is working through the difficulties in such a way that he has a word to proclaim about life under the sun in view of eternity, in view of God, and he has some words to speak here. And so the words of Ecclesiastes are particularly relevant in our contemporary Western culture. I can't remember if I've said it from the pulpit before, but I believe Ecclesiastes is going to be an important book for evangelizing in our current culture, because we're not necessarily, as I think Stephen has talked about some of these things, I've talked about some of these things of kind of how we have gotten to where we are as Americans. And I'm going to suggest that in a culture that has begun kind of fighting against certain traditions and authorities that we have held sacred, that are sacred, but they don't realize it, we might have to approach them in a similar way to Solomon. We might have to say, here's what we acknowledge about this world. Here, your search for identity is not a bad search. It's not an unimportant search. We just need to put it in the right context. And so I think Ecclesiastes is going to be helpful in that sense as we work our way through, is it helps us to understand identity, purpose, and meaning, and put those in biblical terms rather than having to borrow the postmodern versions of those ideas. So I'm going to approach this book as a book that is trying to give us a word of wisdom regarding our existence and our relationship with God in view of the injustice that we see in this world, and that what it will help us to do is to come to a greater fear of God and give us an appreciation for how we can approach those who are not starting in the same place that we are. All right, that brings us to our final slide here. And I know this is several points. I'm going to try to organize them a little bit more in just a moment. But this is basically the framework for the rest of our study beginning next Sunday. If I have counted right, there are 14 points here. And we have, if we include Wednesday, 15 classes. So that means we're going to cover one of these each time. And I mentioned at the beginning of Song of Songs that I was going to be a little bit more leisurely in my approach through Song of Songs, maybe go beyond just the strict outline. And we did that so that we had some more time to kind of dig in and understand the book of Song of Songs. Well, now we have to actually do what I typically do and actually cover the material that I intend to cover each class. So that, now there was a purpose to the madness, if you will, in that I taught Song of Songs first at a slight, as I said, a leisurely pace, not only because I think it comes earlier in the life of Solomon than Ecclesiastes does, and not only because I know that we have studied Ecclesiastes more than we have studied Song of Songs, but also I know that I typically take some vacation time around the holidays to go see family, and Andrew Bullington and Stephen can thank me later that I did not switch those and give them Song of Songs for the times that I'll be away. And so we'll actually have an ordered progression through the rest of our studies, and I appreciate those men having volunteered to take some of the classes that I'll be away for. I am going to try something slightly different than what I typically do on Wednesday night. As I said, we have 15 classes and there are 14 points. On Wednesday, we are going to read through the entire book of Ecclesiastes in class. It takes about 30 to 40 minutes to do so, so we should be right on track. I have some volunteers who are going to read 2 chapters at a time, and they're going to read loudly and clearly for all of us. You can follow along in your own Bible. I'm also going to put it on the screen. But I thought it would be helpful. I always ask you to read the entire book before we study it. I don't know that we all do that, and so now I'm forcing everyone to do that. So Wednesday, we are all going to read through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we're going to try to look for the overarching flow of this book, kind of hear it in one setting. I think that's helpful, to hear it in a single setting, and then we'll start working through piece by piece on the following Sunday. Let me, in our final 5 minutes, talk a little bit about how you could group some of these ideas together. And so chapter 1, verses 1 through 10, I think is kind of a prologue, the introduction to the book. And let's go to chapter 1 for just a moment. We spent some time in verse 1 when we talked about authorship, but it says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Now, we just studied Song of Songs. And remember that I made a case for calling it Song of Songs instead of Song of Solomon because, number one, Solomon calls it Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. But what was the other reason why we said it was important to think of it as Song of Songs? What does that phrase express? Superlative, the greatest of songs. So like Holy of Holies is the most holy place. Song of Songs is the most beautiful song, the greatest song of all time. What do you think Solomon is saying when he says vanity of vanities? Absolutely. It appears to be completely worthless and fleeting. Now, I'll talk about this more on next Sunday. But when we talk about vanity, I think he is using this word because it has a range of meaning that allows him to cover a lot of bases as he works his way through the book. This could mean purposelessness, meaninglessness, It can also mean something that is fleeting, that is transient, that is very quick. And I think he's going to pull up both of those ideas as he works through the book in saying, it seems like everything is meaningless. It seems like everything is going away very quickly. And so how do we make sense of this? And in this introduction, what he's going to try to accomplish is demonstrating through kind of a beautiful poem here in verses 3 through 11, the seeming repetition and emptiness of things that are happening, and then how does man fit into that scenario? Which then he'll get into more kind of personal aspects. And so I would group chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 6 and verse 12 under the heading of the explorations and observations of the preacher Solomon. So as we read the next 4-ish chapters, we're going to be looking at what does Solomon see? In view of the conclusion that he's come to, that everything is vanity, everything seems completely and totally worthless, what has led him to that conclusion? And then what are some of the applications or some of the correctives that he would make to that? And so this first several chapters are the explorations, observations, and again, he's speaking as a preacher. So let's listen to him as one who is gathering this assembly and having a word to this assembly, particularly about their fear of God. And then the second part, I think, is going to be how, though he deals with wisdom in the first section, he's going to deal a lot more with wisdom and some other elements. And so I would label chapter 7 through the beginning of chapter 12 as the value of faith, wisdom, and piety in a disordered world. Let's do some quick definitions just so we're all on the same page. Faith, I think he's going to be dealing with this idea as we have talked about, even though this is Old Testament and it's not the Greek word pistis that we have studied before, that this is this will include the concepts of loyalty, faithfulness to God, along with just simple belief in God. And so we're combining conviction and commitment in a singular idea. Wisdom, we're going to see that he is going to show that if it is not a wisdom built on the fear of God, it is going to be empty. It's going to not seem to provide fulfillment. But then piety, we've used this word before and it's been preached before, so this is kind of a quiz to see how well you're listening. What does the word piety mean? Or what does it relate to? Devoted duty. Very good. Any other synonyms you want to throw in there? Very good. And specifically in this book, we will be dealing with piety as it relates to our approach to God. Everybody has a piety, but we're dealing with that approach to God, reverence, commitment to Him, devotedness to Him. And we're going to see how that plays out in the applications, in fact, the direct commands that he gives toward the end of the book, which leads us to the conclusion, which Solomon helpfully labels for us as the conclusion of the whole matter. After everything has been seen and heard, this is what it all boils down to, and he's going to say, fear God and keep his commandments. And so we'll work our way through. I won't be coming back to this outline every time. We're going to be working through major sections, but if you want it, I'm sure it will eventually be on the website. You can kind of get a copy of that if that helps you to kind of have an overarching view of Ecclesiastes. But as we approach this book, I want us to note that this is Solomon, old man, preaching to the assembly, saying, I did it wrong. Here's what you need to add in so that you can have a good life before God in view of eternity, because you're going to be judged by God. And ultimately, your identity, your meaning, your purpose should all be bound up in Him. All right, appreciate everyone's participation, and we'll have our reading on Wednesday night.